Morning and welcome to the 18th meeting of the Social Security Committee. We have apologies from Bob Doris and everyone else is present. Move to agenda item 1, which is decision on taking our business in private. Are members content to agree that? Since no one is indicated in the chat box, then I'll presume that that's agreed. Thank you very much. We move on to agenda item 2, budget scrutiny. So the committee will take evidence from the Scottish Fiscal Commission and I would like to welcome them. So we have Professor David Ulliff, who is a Commissioner. We have Professor Alistair Smith, also Commissioner, and Claire Murdoch, Head of Devolved Taxes and Social Security. So welcome this morning to the Social Security Committee, and we'll begin, and I will invite Professor Ulliff to make an opening statement, and Alistair Smith will take most of the questions. Over to you.
Good morning, and thank you for asking the Fiscal Commission to give evidence. Over the last month, you have published 5 documents. I will say a little about each of these in turn, but not keep you too long, so we have the maximum time for questions. But before I do that, it's worth clarifying what we won't be able to cover today. We have on our social security forecasts. When we get to the Scottish budget, which we still expect to be in December, we will produce updated forecasts of social security spending in Scotland. We should also have updated information on funding and on the block grant adjustments from the UK government. So turning back to the 5 documents, the first of these that we recently published was our second fiscal update. Amongst other things, this set out our expectations of what we think may happen to the economy and to social security's payments. We expect unemployment to rise, particularly as the initial UK government employment support schemes come to an end, and we expect incomes to be lower for many people. These effects are likely to be felt for many years to come. Translating this into social security spending, we expect spending on low-income benefits to increase, reflecting the increase in universal credit claims that we've seen over the last 6 months. For the disability and carer benefits administered by DWP, there have been a number of changes, including suspension of face-to-face assessments. We expect that this may increase spending. 2 other documents we recently published were our costings to accompany the secondary legislation for 2 new payments that are due to start later this financial year: the Scottish Child Payment and Child Winter Heating Assistance. Our Scottish Child Payment costing takes account of our expectations for the economy. So although the delayed launch of the payment means that spending in this financial year is expected to be £10 million lower than we forecast in February, spending in the following 5 years is expected to be higher. We're assuming more children will be living in households receiving qualifying benefits. And we're also assuming take-up increases as awareness of financial support may have improved during the crisis. In the second costing for Child Winter Heating Assistance, we expect £2.9 million to be spent this year, making payments to 14,000 children who are receiving the highest care rate of child disability living allowance. Having said a little bit about the future, I'll turn now to the past on our final 2 recent publications. As you know, we are required to evaluate our forecasts each year. Our forecast evaluation report for 2019-20 mainly covers the period before the impact of COVID-19. So taken collectively, spending on devolved Social Security was within 2% of the forecast we produced in December 2018 to inform the 2019-20 budget. Our forecasts were very close to actual spending for the more established benefits, for example, carers allowance, but relative errors were larger for the newer payments introduced by Social Security Scotland. Our more recent forecasts already incorporate some of the lessons we have learned from that report, for example, higher take-up assumptions. But in the light of the effects of COVID-19, we anticipate reporting relatively large errors when we evaluate our 2020-21 forecast next year. The final publication is our Statement of Data Needs, which sets out the areas where we believed improved information would support our work. Most relevant to this committee is our requirement to access information from the UK government. This request relates to benefits that DWP administers on behalf of the Scottish Government, and these are largely based on UK government rules. If the UK government makes changes to these rules, as they have done in response to COVID-19, with the suspension of face-to-face assessments and award reviews, this has a direct effect on Scottish spending. Yet at the moment, we have no direct access to information about such proposed changes. However, we have had constructive discussions with Treasury and hope to reach an agreement to ensure that we have access to this information ahead of the autumn budget. And with that, I'll hand back to you, Convener, for the question and answer session.
Thank you very much, Professor. And I'll firstly call Shona Robson to ask the first question.
Good morning, everyone. And my apologies if you referred to this, Professor Ulf, in your comments. That it was difficult to hear the start of your comments, your evidence. So my first question was around the cancellation of the UK autumn budget, and at what stage any in-year reconciliations in respect of the Social Security budget be made. I'm not sure if you said that was the end of the year.
Yes, we expect the reconciliations will be made in the year. We are expecting that although the UK budget has been postponed, we will still be getting a forecast from the and we'll still be getting block grant adjustments for the coming financial year. So we'll still be able to produce a forecast in December.
Okay, that's most helpful. Sorry, just on you touched on this around the implications of that increased level of uncertainty around budgetary adjustments in respect of Social Security specifically. You touched on this a little bit. Could you say a bit more about what those implications may be?
Okay, in our fiscal update, we certainly said that there would be challenging times ahead for the Scottish Government. They were given a 6.5 billion guarantee of follow-on payments from the UK Government. That's a minimum 6.5 billion. Our understanding is from the County of Scotland that about 5.3 billion of that has already been committed to announced programmes. So there's some flexibility there, perhaps to use some additional money for upcoming adjustments that may need to be made. We know that there's going to be a reconciliation for income tax, and the Scottish Government's already borrowed 2.7 billion. 2.7 million out of the 300 million they have available. There's only about 93 million left in borrowing powers. So it is going to be a challenging time ahead. But it is possible that, following on from the guarantee that the Treasury gave for the 6.5 billion, there may be additional flexibilities that could be agreed later in the year if it becomes really challenging for the Scottish Government. We know that they have requested additional flexibilities, and although the Treasury has not said yes, equally it's not said no.
I mean, what you're saying really is the huge disparity between the figures around reconciliation and the figure that remains for borrowing powers. I mean, those are just eye-wateringly different. How optimistic are you that there may be movement on that by the Treasury?
That is not for us to say, I'm afraid. All I can say is they did give some flexibility by guaranteeing the 6.5 billion already. So it's possible that there could be more flexibility.
Okay, thank you.
Can I ask Alistair Smith if he wants to add anything? Professor Alistair Smith, if you wanted to add anything to that?
Yes, I would like to add one point in response to what Ms. Robinson said about the size of reconciliations of mismatches that might occur in this year's budget. I think the key point to emphasise is that at this stage, there's a lot of uncertainty. So far, it looks as if additional expenditure by the Scottish Government in social security and in other ways is tracking fairly closely increased expenditure at the UK level, which means that what are called consequentials flow into the Scottish budget. So we don't know that there are going to be big mismatches that will put a lot of strain on the very limited borrowing powers of the Scottish Government. What we do know is there's a huge degree of uncertainty about that, and we could indeed, Ms. Robinson, end up towards the end of the year with very big mismatches and limited borrowing powers. But we don't know yet whether that's going to be the case.
Thank you very much. I'd like to call Rachel Hamilton.
And thanks for giving evidence this morning. I want to pick up on Shona Robeson's question and get a bit more granular detail regarding the borrowing situation. So you said, Professor, that the reconciliation, which is for 17-18, leaves 93 million that the Scottish Government could borrow for the forecast era. Is there any possibility, and can you explain what the conditions would be for the Scotland-specific economic shock borrowing powers, which could be increased to 600 million? When does that kick in? And if so, should it or would it kick in?
So, Professor Alistair Smith.
Okay, let me just answer. First of all, let me just say the 207 million is not for reconciliation. That's borrowing the Scottish Government has already made. So to go back to your question about the Scottish-specific shock, there's two conditions for that. One is that GDP has to fall by more than 1%, and that's already been met, I think. The other is that the GDP growth has to be 1% less than UK growth over the year. And at the moment, that still doesn't look as if it's going to be the case. It's a little bit lower, but it's not of the order of 1% lower. Going back to what Alistair said, there are huge uncertainties. So it's still conceivable that by the end of the year, we will have the conditions for a Scottish-specific shock. But at the moment, we're making the recommendation the Scottish Government does not count on there being a Scottish-specific shock.
Thank you. Before I ask Rachel Hamilton to follow up, Professor Alistair Smith, do you want to add anything, or do you want to call Claire Murdoch to add anything?
No, I don't want to add anything to what David has said.
Thank you. Rachel Hamilton.
Okay, just to pick up on a point that was made regarding the increase in the universal credit applications and on the shortfall in tax revenue. There is obviously it's indexed in line with per capita as it is in England and Wales. How do you work out the parallel increase or the mirror of that increase? I mean, how do you factor that in, and how can you get that information, and how soon should that be available that might influence the budget, the Scottish budget?
I think I will ask Claire to answer that, because I think she'll have more detail.
Thank you. So the block grant adjustments are calculated based on what's happening in England and Wales. So we have some information about what's happening to benefit spend in the rest of the UK. And we also have some information about what's happening in Scotland. When the OBR publish their forecasts in the autumn, they will look at the rest of the UK, they will produce their forecasts, and those will be used to calculate the block grant adjustments. And we'll also be doing the same thing in Scotland. You know, for the largest benefits, which are related to carers allowance and the disability benefits, the policies are broadly similar in the two countries, and we would expect the trend to the spend to broadly track in both countries. So this means that what we would expect is that any increase in spending in the rest of the UK would also occur in Scotland. That won't necessarily be the case for the smaller benefits, but there are a smaller amount of money in relation to the total level of spending on social security. As both Alistair and David have said, these are the things that we'll be looking at when we get to publish our forecasts at the time of the Scottish budget. And those are the questions that you should be asking us then as well. And they're the right questions to ask. But until the OBR publish their next forecast, we won't know quite what their thinking is going to happen to spending in the rest of the UK. So it's a little bit of wait and see, but it's also, you know, we know broadly that the policies continue to be aligned for the larger spending, and therefore we think they should largely offset, but that doesn't mean they'll perfectly offset. So the government may have to manage some difference in spend here.
Thank you very much. Rachel Hamilton, are you content?
I'm finished, convener. That was very helpful.
Thank you. Can I just add a supplementary to that, just to want to make sure it understood? Probably it's better directed to Professor Ulliff. You said earlier that because the DWP had made some changes in regards face-to-face changes, obviously, because they can't do that anymore, and that has a direct effect on Scottish spending. Can we presume that if that has resulted in an increase in the UK budget, that has resulted in an increase in Scottish expenditure accordingly?
Yes, there will be corresponding effects on Scottish spending, and we do need to understand exactly what's happening to face-to-face interviews and to assessments. And it's something which we've been looking at already in thinking ahead of our forecasts for the coming year. We're thinking about this. But at the moment, as I say, up until now, we were not told in advance of these things. So we're just trying to get to a position where, if they are thinking about this, we're informed of it a lot earlier, so we can start factoring that into our thinking at a much earlier stage.
And in this case, does that result in an increase in the Scottish budget if there's been an increase in the UK budget as a result of that policy decision?
I think I'd go back to Claire and ask, I'm not quite sure whether that does have an immediate effect in terms of block grant adjustment. Claire, does that?
Thank you, David. So Since the start of the COVID crisis, as you said, DWP suspended face-to-face assessments. They've made a number of operational changes so they can handle the large increase in universal credit claims. And what those have effectively done is we think that will increase spending on disability living allowance and personal independence payment. Do we think that will happen in the rest of the UK and in Scotland? So therefore, we expect that to feed through into the block grant adjustments, which will increase the funding for Scotland. And we also think the Scottish spending will increase. We'll need to consider as we get more information whether those two things perfectly match, but largely that increase should be offset.
Thank you very much. That's really helpful. We're moving on to theme 2, impact of the coronavirus pandemic on the 2021 budget, and I call Tom Arthur.
Thank you very much, Convener, and good morning to our panel. My opening question is really quite general, and it's open to any member of the panel. I would like to get a sense of what the challenges, and I presume we would prefix that with unprecedented challenges, are in trying to produce forecasts during a pandemic. I wonder what the reflections are of the commissioners to date, and also what conversations are perhaps taking place in the wider forecasting community about attempting to come to terms with the situation that we face and how to produce accurate forecasts.
Shall we start with Professor Alistair Smith? Do you want to field that question to whoever you think?
Well, I'll happily address that question. Yes, forecasting is an enormous challenge in the current circumstances, and we have not revised our formal forecast. We'll be producing a fresh set of forecasts in December to accompany the Scottish budget. What we have done during the year is produced 2 fiscal updates that indicate how the Scottish Government's budget is changing in these unprecedented times. And the things that we have already been discussing in this session have been reflected in these fiscal updates. And these fiscal updates, for the reasons that we've discussed, are already are done in conditions of great uncertainty, and the issues that go into them are the ones that we have already touched on, that a very large part of social security expenditure, for example, universal credit itself, is not devolved. So that's a UK government responsibility that doesn't affect the Scottish budget. But another large group of Scottish government expenditure on social security that match UK government spending and that are administered by DWP, where, as Claire said a moment ago, there are a lot of uncertainty, but we would, broadly speaking, expect the additional funding coming from the UK government to match Scottish government additional commitments, but there's quite a bit of variation. And then there are the Scottish specific budgets on things like Best Start Grant, for which universal credit eligibility creates an eligibility for these Scottish specific grants, where the Scottish budget is both more uncertain and more exposed. But as Claire said, these are a relatively small component of the overall Scottish social security budget. But it's a position of great uncertainty, and which we're doing our best to track. And as David said, as we get nearer the end of the year, we'll be clearer whether there are stresses in the Scottish government budget that will make a strong case for UK Treasury intervention. And then looking forward, we're going to face very large challenges in forecasting next year's budget for all of the reasons we've been talking.
Thank you.
Okay.
Tom Arthur?
Thank you, Convener. Professor Smith, is there any early indications of how the impact of COVID has been distributed across the UK, specifically the relationship between Scotland and our UK? Is the impact uniform? Is Scotland perhaps facing a less severe impact, or are the difficulties and challenges being felt around, for example, in the labour market more acute in Scotland? What is the early data telling us?
Well, the broad picture from the early data is that there are very small differences in the medical indicators of the effects of COVID. As I'm sure you know, there are several different ways of measuring, for example, the number of COVID-related deaths. And on some of those measures, the death rate in Scotland is just slightly below the UK. But on the main measure, the excess mortality rate in the statistics, the percentage in Scotland is exactly the same as the overall UK percentage. Scotland's share of UK deaths is 8%, which is exactly matches share of the UK population. So far, and of course there's no guarantee this is going to continue. The pandemic effects could turn out, could change, their distribution could change, but so far Scotland doesn't seem to have been either more or less impacted medically than the rest of the UK. In the economic effects, obviously there are some parts of the Scottish economy, tourism and hospitality, that are more exposed to the lockdown effects than the UK economy as a whole. But those differences are not very great. There are parts of the UK economy, for example, London and the South East, that are just as exposed to tourism and hospitality as Scotland is. So at the moment, so far, and I really stress those qualifications, so far, differences between Scotland and the rest of the UK are relatively small, but that could change, and it could change quickly, and we have to be aware of the risks that it could change.
Thank you. Professor David Ulf, did you want to come in here?
I just wanted to add one point to what Alistair said. Some of the economic effects of COVID don't come just through lockdown. They also come through the behaviour of consumers, for example, their willingness to fly and travel abroad. So some of those uncertainties that consumers face could be affecting the economy for quite a period of time to come, even if there's no official lockdown taking place. So there's a number of different channels through which COVID is exercising its effect on the economy.
Thank you very much. Tom, are you content?
If it's possible, can we now have one final question?
Yeah, on you go.
Can we now direct it to Professor Smith? The final question is, of course, there is uncertainty with regards to the virus, but there is also uncertainty with regards to what economic packages may or may not become available throughout the winter. So I'm trying to phrase this question in a way that's not leading or in any such way political, but could you perhaps give an idea of what the significance of impact would be on around uncertainty in forecasting as to whether or not there was a change of policy around the job support scheme, which is going to come in to replace furlough? For example, the Scottish Government have estimates around the number of jobs that could be saved if the furlough scheme was extended for the further 6 to 8 months. How significant an impact on forecasting are the policy interventions by both the Scottish and the UK Government, which we don't necessarily know what's going to emerge in the coming months from either government?
Yes, Alistair Smith, can you answer that?
Yes, well, I'm grateful, Mr. Arthur, to you for asking the question in a way that's not too politically leading. Of course, the Fiscal Commission that doesn't take political positions. The fact is, of course, that a large part of the economic response to the pandemic is run by the UK government. It's not the main programmes being run are not devolved programmes. And the job furlough scheme is one of the main examples. And the successor to the furlough scheme announced by the UK Chancellor last week is again a UK programme. So it doesn't. These are things which are the UK government's responsibility. They will, of course, have effects in Scotland as in the rest of the UK, and it's it's clear that the successor programme to the furlough scheme is going to put much less money into protecting jobs than the furlough scheme had, and therefore we would expect in the coming months probably quite substantial increases in unemployment across the UK, including in Scotland, and that will then impact on the Scottish Government's responsibilities, even though the Scottish Government itself does not have the responsibility for the job protection programmes themselves.
Thank you very much. Moving on to theme 3, impact of the coronavirus on social security expenditure in regard to devolve and new benefits. I call Mark Griffin.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning. I had a number of questions around how changes to the economy and the impact of coronavirus would affect spending in Scotland through changes to the block grant adjustment and changes in behaviour, but they've been largely covered. But it'd be good to get more detailed information on your forecasts as we go forward as to whether there's likely to be a positive or a negative impact on the Scottish budget for that. But just if I could ask around the payments and social security entitlements which aren't dependent on the block grant. I'm thinking Scottish Child Payment, Carers Allowance Supplement, Best Start and other payments. What are the Fiscal Commission's forecasts of whether demand for those entitlements is likely to increase as a result of the pandemic and the economic situation, and to what extent they may increase and the impact that would have on the Scottish budget?
I'll ask Claire to respond in detail, but the broad answer is that yes, we, in forecasting these benefits which fall directly on those Scottish benefits which fall directly on the Scottish budget, like the new Scottish Child Payment, we do look very closely at what the economic effects of the pandemic might be, and specifically, as I think I mentioned earlier, the way that increased eligibility for universal credit will make a larger group of families eligible for the Scottish Child Payment. It's perhaps not as big an effect as you might think at first sight, but I think it's probably best if Claire elaborates on the way that we take those effects into account in looking at the Scottish specific benefits.
Thank you. Claire Murdoch.
Thank you, Alistair and Convener. So we've published an updated forecast of the Scottish Child Payment, and the reason that we did this was the legislation was introduced into Parliament, and our latest forecast was published in February. And obviously the world has changed quite a lot since then. We've seen this large increase in universal credit claims that we've talked about, but also, the nature of the economy is changing. People's awareness of the different kinds of support that are available has also changed. So for that reason, we increased our forecast of spending on the Scottish Child Payment, and we have two effects through which this effect applies. So the first one is more people we think are eligible. So we've got more families in receipt of universal credit. Their incomes might have fallen, so they might still be in work but have a lower level of income, or they may have lost their jobs and therefore receive universal credit. So we've got an increased eligible population, number of children who could qualify for support. We've also slightly increased our take-up rate assumption. So we think because at the moment there's more discussion of support available, more people are maybe aware of it. There may also be a slightly reduced stigma at the moment because it's more seen as a form of support. We increased our take-up rate assumption slightly as well. And that's what we've published for the Scottish Child Payment. We haven't published updated forecasts for the other benefits, but it's reasonable to assume that we may make similar judgments for other benefits. So the Best Start grant would be affected in a similar way. Best Start Foods is a similar population as children under the age of 6 in low-income households. Funeral support payments, we think spending may also increase. More people are receiving universal credit and therefore may qualify. And we've also sadly seen a higher level of deaths over the last 6 months as well. And then there's other areas where the government have announced policies to increase funding directly. So things like discretionary housing payments and the Scottish Welfare Fund both seen increases in spending relative to what we thought was going to be spent in February. So these are the areas that you would be looking for when we publish our forecasts alongside the Scottish budget, and we'll say a bit more at that time about what we've actually forecast, but these are the things that we'll be taking into account.
Thank you very much. And Professor David Ulliff.
Yeah, I just want to add one thing to what Claire was saying, is that in addition to the effects that she's been talking about, for some benefits we've seen a fall in applications. That's because people are not getting access to advice from other family members or from citizens' advice bureaus or other people. So there's been a kind of missing tranche of applications. And so that we expect will bounce back, that over time these people who would have applied but haven't will still apply for benefits. And we're trying to work out what rate of recovery there will be in those claims. And that's something which we're actively thinking about. So there's a number of quite complex channels through which COVID is going to affect social security spending.
Thank you. That's a really helpful comment, Professor. Mark Griffin.
Yep, just a brief supplementary. Professor Ulf preempted it. I was just going to ask about what the impact of the pandemic may be on uptake as a result of reduced accessibility to advice services, and just if the uptake on some entitlements is so if there's a big variation from your forecasts, would you expect the Scottish Government to look at the advice services and how they're delivered to almost bridge that gap?
Well, there are some quite complex effects going on here. I was thinking more about benefits which are administered by DWP, and our understanding is that this is not a capacity issue within DWP. It's more that people have not been able to access the advice they would need to start to initiate claim for benefits. And DWP are doing some quite complex things and shifting around their business because they know there will be this wave of catch-up claims coming down the road. So they're going to bring forward dates at which they process some other claims to allow them to manage some of these backlogs claims. So they are trying to respond to this by rearranging their workload. And of course, that means we have quite complex issues to try to model as the exact timing and incidence of all these benefit claims. That's something which we are actively trying to think about and model at the moment.
Thank you. And lastly, Claire Murdoch.
Thank you. If I can just add very briefly to everything David said. So he's largely been talking about the reserved benefit, the benefits which are administered by DWP. So we've seen a reduction in claims for the personal independence payment. Meanwhile, we're expecting an increase in claims relating to universal credit because we saw those claims increase. So he's absolutely right that there's a bit of different things balancing here and different benefits affected in different ways. You talked about the need for the government to provide support services, and I think that's one of the things the Scottish Government will be looking at as part of their uptake strategy as well, and that's something that we take into account is the policies the government's going to be introducing in response to push up take-up. So we'll be asking the government those questions as we produce our next forecast and taking that into account if they are planning any policies to increase take-up either in the benefits administered by Social Security Scotland or in those which are currently administered by DWP.
Thank you very much. So still on this theme, Alison Johnson.
Thank you very much, convener. My questions actually are around the Scottish Child Payment, convener. Is that okay?
Yes. Yep. Fine. That's fine. Yep.
So the under 60s take-up is estimated by the Commission to be 80% in the first year. And while I appreciate there's been a revision upwards, 80% take-up would still involve 20% missing out, obviously. And I'd be grateful if the Commission could explain a little bit more about how you arrive at that estimate and why the Commission is estimating that only 80% will claim. And in particular, Are there clear reasons why the take-up is estimated to be much lower than child benefit, which is usually more than 90%? That's my first question. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Alistair Smith, do you want to start?
Yes, well, I'll ask Claire to respond in detail to that. But let me say by way of introduction, we have indeed raised our estimate of the take-up rate. We recognise that this is a very ambitious programme. An 80% take-up rate is actually a pretty high take-up rate. It's only slightly less than the Scottish Government's target for what it too recognises to be a very ambitious programme. No programme is going to have a 100% take-up rate for all sorts of complex reasons, but perhaps Claire can address these issues in more detail.
So we've got some information already on what's happening to Best Start Grant and Best Start Foods in terms of the take-up rate that we're seeing there. Essentially, people have to first apply for universal credit or one of the legacy benefits, and then put in an application to Social Security Scotland to apply for Best Start Grant or the Scottish Child Payment. So for those reasons, we expect take-up to be slightly lower. It will be definitely be less than 100%. We're assuming that take-up for the Scottish Child Payment will be higher. So it's already, we think, quite an ambitious take-up assumption for the government. Obviously, as the benefit launches and we see what happens, we'll revise that assumption. And it may be that take-up is higher, but it could also be lower. So we're trying to produce what we think is a central forecast where we don't, we're not setting a target for the government. This is sort of what we think, based on the current policy, they may achieve. I should also add one caveat around how we estimate take-up. So although the way we're calculating is we say this number of children are eligible for the payment and then this many will receive it, and that means you say, well, 20% are missing out. We're having to estimate, at the moment, we're having to estimate the number of eligible children, and the number of people who are actually eligible could be higher, but it could also be lower. And any variation in the number who are eligible also affects the number who take up the benefit. So the Scottish Government have some plans to write to all households that are eligible, and if they start doing that, then firstly, we'd expect that to tell us how many people are and aren't applying for the benefit, but also it should give the Scottish Government a better way of targeting households to try and increase that take-up rate.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. I'd be interested to know, your estimate is just very slightly lower than the Scottish Government's estimate. I'd be interested to learn about that little difference, but I'd also be grateful if you could explain, well, the Commission estimates that by 2024 or 25, take-up will be 80% for under-6s and 70% for the other age group, averaging out at 73%. And I'd just be grateful for your explanation as to why you think take-up will be lower for older children.
Professor Alistair Smith, do you want to start?
Well, do you want to continue with that then, Claire?
Claire.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yes. So the question about the different take-up rates by different ages. So we are assuming a fairly high take-up rate for under-6s. There's a lot of communication that go to parents in this age group. There's also, we think that the presence of the Best Start Grant and Best Start Foods payments will also help raise awareness. So that's part of the reason why we think take-up will be high in this age group. We think that take-up could potentially be lower for older children. So some children will have received the Scottish Child Payment or the Best Start Grant when they're under 6, and then as they're over 6, they'll still receive it. So we factored that greater awareness into our assumption. But at the same time, we think, it's a large group of children from 6 to 16, and therefore not all of the parents in that age group will necessarily be as aware. So we think that group will be harder to keep informed about it and for them to apply. You also asked about the difference between our assumption and the Scottish Government's. I think originally our assumption was lower than the Scottish Government's. We've raised it after everything. So the initial government assumption was made in June 2019. We're now more than a year after that, and the world looks quite different. Our initial assumption was lower. We've raised our take-up assumption given everything that's happening at the moment. But I think I would not like to say that there's any real difference, suggesting that we have the accuracy to forecast a take-up rate between 80 and 83%. We can't be that accurate about it. I think we're broadly in the same ballpark as the Scottish Government here. Alistair, I don't know if you want to add anything.
Alison?
No, I have nothing to add to that.
Thank you, that's very helpful. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. And we have Keith Brown on forecast evaluation.
Thanks, Convener, and thanks to the panel as well. Your report says that you now estimate that take-up rates were higher than forecasts of both Best Start Grant and Best Start Foods, adding around £5 million. For both benefits, your assumptions were informed by the take-up rates estimated to have been achieved by the predecessor Sure Start maternity grants and Healthy Start vouchers, which of course are run by the DWP and the DHSC respectively. You've also said that this increased take-up is not related to COVID because that happened too late. So are you able to attribute any reasons to the increased take-up which is taking place in relation to these two grants?
Best Alistair Smith, who's best to take that question?
Claire, would you like to pick that up?
Thank you, Claire.
Thank you. Yes. Yes. So our first forecast of the Best Start Grant and Best Start Foods were produced in December 18. So this was before the Best Start Grant was, the first payment was launched in December 18, but obviously we produced our forecast before that point in time. And essentially the only information that we had at that point was what was happening in the previous benefits administered by DWP and the Department of Health. We made assumptions about how we thought take-up would increase. We assumed take-up would be higher under the Scottish benefits, but actually take-up's been higher than we initially assumed. So in December 18, our forecasts were too low. In May 2019, we subsequently revised up our forecast for both the Best Start Grant and Best Start Foods as we got that information about the first payments that were being made, and we could see that take-up was higher. So I think since then we've factored that into our forecasts. There's several reasons why we think take-up is higher. One is the Scottish benefits are more generous. They're paid to a greater range of people. They're larger in cash value. The other reason is also the application processes have been made smoother by the Scottish Government, and also there's been greater advertising campaigns. There's greater awareness. There's links with things like the Parent Club in Scotland to try and tell people about these benefits, and that has been successful in increasing take-up, and we factor that into our forecast. I think we underestimated take-up initially. Essentially, these benefits didn't exist, so we didn't know what was going to happen. We're now factoring that into all our assumptions on new benefits, and that's one of the things that we've definitely taken into account when we're producing our Scottish Child Payment forecast, for example. So we don't think that we're systematically underestimating take-up here. I think we initially did, and then we've rectified that in our subsequent forecasts.
Thank you, Claire. Keith Brown?
Yeah, thanks for that. It gives a very good account of how it's possible to increase the take-up of benefits if you view something as a social investment. I just wonder, though, going back to Shona Robertson's points earlier on, the absence of a UK budget doesn't seem to have fazed the Commission too much. I'd always thought of it as being a kind of fundamental thing in how you come about with your forecasts. Is that because, first of all, is that correct, that it's not such a huge issue for you? And if so, is that because your forecasting will tend to be more involved in the demand-led nature of budgets rather than the supply of money, if you like, to meet that? I was just a wee bit taken aback by how sanguine you appeared about the absence of a UK budget.
Thank you. Alistair, who's best to take this question?
Well, we wouldn't want to give the impression that the absence of a UK budget is completely unproblematic. It does create a significant problem for the Scottish Government's budget process, as I think the Cabinet Secretary has already said. For us, however, you need to distinguish between two things: the OBR forecast, which normally accompany the UK budget, and the UK budget itself. it was very difficult for us this year producing forecasts to accompany the Scottish budget in, was it January, because there were no OBR forecasts, because there had been no UK. We therefore didn't have good forecasts of the block grant adjustment, with the result that the in-year reconciliations for Social Security in last year's budget had to be carried forward to this year, because we didn't in December get the accurate information that would have given us and the Scottish Government information to feed into the budgetary process. So the Chancellor has now said that the OBR is going to continue to go ahead and produce forecasts in December, even though there isn't going to be a UK budget. And that makes it possible for us to proceed with our forecasts. And evidently, it makes it possible for the Scottish Government to proceed with a December budget. But it's not problem-free, because one of the big elements of the Scottish budget, especially at a time that the UK budget is moving around a lot, are the consequential changes to the block grant arising from changes in UK expenditure in devolved areas. So the 14% in-year increase that we've seen in this year's Scottish budget was largely driven by increased UK expenditure on business support, in health, and in other areas. When the Scottish Government is putting together its budget, it needs to know, needs to have a good estimate of what the block grant is, and without a UK, or what the block grant is going to be next year, and without a UK budget, those estimates are much harder to make and much less unreliable. So that's, I think we can go ahead and do forecasts. They won't be forecasts that would be as good as they would be if we had a UK budget, but they're still useful forecasts for the government to work with in developing its budget. But the bigger difficulty of not having a UK budget before the Scottish budget is a difficulty for the Scottish Government in putting its budget together. But we can go ahead and do our forecast, and our understanding is that the government can go ahead and do its budget. It's not ideal, but everybody is going to try and make it work. At least everybody is going to try and make it work.
Thank you. Keith, you have follow-up?
Last point, if I can, Convener, just to say that, of course, your forecasts are not academic as many other economic forecasters are. They're a fundamental part of the budget process. I just wonder, though, looked at from outside, if it's the case that the UK changes help form what the basis of the block grant is, it then applies to Scotland, whether Scotland has got greater or lesser changes or doesn't have the same changes at all. And all the uncertainty that surrounds that, do you not think that this makes the process so opaque from a member of the public looking in the process? I'm not saying that the public will want to understand every nuance of how this is done, but they will want to know it's a fairly straightforward process, and it just seems to be so much guesswork. And even on the basis of the block grant, that's based on what's happening elsewhere. It may or may not be mirrored in Scotland, but it doesn't follow inevitably that it is. It just seems a very opaque and odd process overall for services in Scotland.
Thank you, Keith. I'm going to call Professor David Olive.
Just a point of view, and I'd be interested in your comment.
Okay, just to respond to that particular point, one of the reasons why we decided to produce our fiscal update back in the earlier part of the year was precisely to address that issue. We realized that because of the potential lag between forecasts, both by us and by OBR, people might be wondering what was actually happening to the Scottish budget. So we thought it would be really helpful as an organisation if we were to put out our fiscal update, bring some clarity to what was actually happening to the Scottish budget. And that's why we also produce an update in September, we just felt a lot of things had been happening over the summer. The public and Parliament would want to try to understand the implications of that for the Scottish budget. And we felt it would be really helpful if we brought out our second fiscal update at the start of September. So these were things we were doing precisely to plug the gap that Mr. Brown was talking about.
Thank you very much. That's really helpful. And Professor David. Alistair, sorry, Alistair Smith.
And just continuing that, responding to Mr. Brown's question, one way of looking at what's going to happen next year is that next year is going to be more like this year than it would be if we had a UK budget, in the sense that the Scottish Government is going to put its budget together with the help of our forecast before there's a UK budget. And then at some point, we hope early in 2021, the UK government will produce a budget, and there will then be revisions to the Scottish budget, and we will find ourselves, I would expect, producing fiscal updates alongside that. And in the worst case scenario, where the UK government budget is postponed for a long time and the UK simply rolls forward with additional ad hoc expenditure changes in response to the pandemic, then the Scottish Government will find itself facing the kind of revisions that it has faced this year, and we will do our best with fiscal updates to keep the government and the Scottish public informed about the budget situation as it develops during the year. We would all prefer to get as much certainty as possible in December. We're not going to get as much certainty as we would ideally like, but I think we all have to face the fact that we're living in through a time of very great economic and therefore fiscal uncertainty.
Thank you very much. Before I call Jeremy Balfour for the final set of questions, I just wanted to ask a supplementary on this, the heading of forecast evaluation. I've read from the Spice Notes, the government, we know, can borrow up to £300 million, but they already plan to spend 207 of that to manage income tax reconciliation for 17-18. Now that leaves £93 million to borrow for forecast error. In your opinion, happy for anyone to answer this, how tight is that in relation to the Social Security budget? Professor Alistair Smith?
I think the figures speak for themselves. The Scottish Government's borrowing powers are very constrained. The borrowing powers are only for forecast error. Scope for forecast error in current circumstances is very great. It's a very tight situation. As David said earlier, the UK Treasury has not said no to the Scottish Government's requests for further flexibility, and as the rest of this year, this budget year progresses, we will see whether these pressures on Scottish borrowing powers become so great that the Treasury feels it has to respond. So yes, it is, and I think looking further ahead, when we're through this process and look back at the fiscal framework within which we operate at the moment, one of the questions that people will want to ask in the review of the fiscal framework is, what have we learned during the pandemic about the adequacy of the Scottish Government's borrowing powers at a time of economic and social emergency? And that's a question that's probably best addressed in the future when the fiscal framework is being reviewed, and we'll be able to look back at this year's experience and draw the appropriate lessons from it.
Thank you, that's excellent. Move on to Jeremy Balfour, who's going to have some questions on the Best Start grant and demand-led benefits. Jeremy, over to you.
Thank you, Deputy Convener. Good morning, everybody. I think actually Chief Ryan covered quite well the issue of best grant, so I won't touch on that. I think it's also interesting to note, though, that I think it was Chief Ryan was actually a member of the Cabinet who signed the agreement with the UK government in regard to how the fiscal system should work. So perhaps he should maybe reflect on what he signed up to when he did. In regard to the issue of devolved benefits, I wonder if you could maybe just expand a wee bit more. Are there any reasons to expect that expenditure in Scotland might be different from expenditure in, say, England and Wales? I think you touched on that a wee bit, but I wonder if you could just maybe, are you expect those in regard to the devolved benefits?
Professor Alice Smith is best to answer that.
Well, I'm not sure that I have anything further to add. The scope for divergence between Scotland and the rest of the UK is certainly there. This is a time of great uncertainty. The uncertainties could affect Scotland quite differently from the rest of the UK. So far, we have not seen evidence of that, but that contingency could arise. I'm sorry, I don't really.
Okay,
maybe
Claire Murdoch, I think, would like to add into that. Claire,
thank you. I'll just add very briefly. So I think the largest benefits which have a block grant adjustment, we expect broadly it will track with the rest of the UK. Probably not exactly. These things never go exactly. It's the benefits which don't have block grant adjustments where we think there could be a difference in terms of what happens in Scotland, and that's because the Scottish Government's introduced different policy. That's a policy choice. So the Best Start grant it's generous. It's made to a greater number of people. The Scottish Child Payment is a new benefit which doesn't exist in the rest of the UK, and where these benefits are linked to universal credit entitlement, and we've seen universal credit entitlement increase, we therefore think spending in Scotland will increase, and that will be different to what is happening in the rest of the UK, which has a different benefit system for those benefits.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, no, that's helpful. Thank you. Can I just move on to one other area? And I was interested in reading the documentation that I noticed that there's a decline in proportion of children receiving the highest rate child disability living allowance, care award. I wonder, have you identified the case, and is there a trend there, or is it just to do with number of children being born with disabilities, or have you got any reasoning behind that?
Yes, let me say something about that, and Claire may want to add to it. Yes, there is indeed a trend, a reduced proportion of children in the reduced proportion of children eligible for the highest rate of disability allowance, and that then has a knock-on effect on the heating allowance forecast. But I think it's important to emphasise that this trend is not a reduction in the numbers of children eligible for the highest rate of disability allowance. It's growth in the number of children eligible for the lower levels. So it's not that somehow children who would we don't think that it's children who would formerly have had the higher rate are now getting the low rate. It's simply that the overall population of children eligible for disability allowance is increasing, and that increase is happening more at the lower level of disability. We think that this is probably because there are higher number of children coming in with disabilities of the form of learning disabilities rather than physical disabilities, and they are eligible for the lower level. But that's our best guess of what's happening. I think it's the one thing I really want to emphasize is it's not the case that fewer children are getting the higher rate. What's happening is that more children are getting the low rate, so the proportion in the low rate is going up. And as I said, we're keeping a close eye on this because what I've said is our best guess as to why the numbers are changing in the way that they're changing. But as always, Claire may have more detail to add to this.
I think Alistair said everything that I could say on that.
Thank you. Jeremy, are you content?
I'm content, Deputy Convener, thank you.
I don't have any other bids for questions. So all members have had a chance to question the Scottish Fiscal Commission. On behalf of the committee, can I thank all three of you for joining us this morning and for your excellent answers to really help us and advise us to go forward in drawing up our own report. Thank you very much. So the committee are now going to go into private session as previously agreed. Do members